Good morning, everyone. Let me add my welcome to that Irene has extended to all of you. And a special welcome to all of those who we are streaming to. Now, we really are in modern times. Welcome to every single one of you. Irene, thanks also for your candour as well about finance, and you alluded to the complexity of finance. I'm assuming, and I'm probably going to go on to make that assumption, that probably is where all of you come from. You're all experts in your own field. But finance, for most of you, probably is one of these nasty F words that somebody else actually does, that you never actually had to understand it because it's far too complex, and that local government finance in itself, with their arcane terms and terminology, is something that other people have to do. But nonetheless, the times that we're actually in, I think demand, in fact, is necessary for people to actually have a fairly broad understanding of finance, not least of which is where you can actually challenge your finance colleagues and actually work with them and actually speak to them in a different kind of conversation. And I'm hoping to give you a brief tour through how you can actually do that today. My brief really is to take you on a brief navigation of public sector finance at a high level, and we'll drill down into public sector finance at local government level and give you that the overall understanding in the 20 minutes I have, such that we can actually give you a bit of confidence and to take you forward to actually think about the challenges that you're going to speak about in detail this afternoon. I wasn't lucky enough to be at the Improvement Service conference, or COSLA conference, last week, but was aware of some of the messages that were actually coming through. And it's hard not to be infected by the message from Colin Mayer when he was talking about leadership and actually talking about how local government should demonstrate leadership. I actually agree with that, and I think that translates into everybody in this room as well. But the first thing you need for leadership is confidence. And I sometimes think that when we get to finance and local government finance, that's when you allow confidence to actually just disappear completely. I don't think you need to. I think that if you bolt on your expertise with what you just need to know about finance, I think that gives you a decent platform for what I think you're trying to achieve today. So more of that over the course of my 20 minutes, hopefully more of that over the course of the day. If there was one image that was only allowed to show you for today, it would probably look something like this. In fact, it'll look pretty much like this. What that actually is a graph of the UK debt, public sector debt. That's the amount of money that we actually borrow to fund all capital projects, in effect, and borrow to fund the shortfall between our spending and our receipts. And you can see there's an obvious pattern there, isn't there? If you actually look back, you can see the spike round about here, which was the financial crash, and it's heading up the way. And on the right-hand side is the percentage of something called GDP, which you maybe hear people talking about, gross domestic product. Think of that as the size of our economy. And what that's actually telling us, that graph, is that our indebtedness as a country is fast becoming the same size as the size of our economy. Now, going back to around about here, in previous 2 or 3 governments ago, it used to be that the golden rule, as we called it, was that public sector debt should be no more than 40% of GDP. We are now hurtling towards in excess of 90%. Now, I specifically chose that graph because it's about a year and a half old. And I chose that because that implies that our level of debt is actually going to decrease after about 2017. It's not. It's actually still going to increase, and it's still on an upward trajectory, and it's probably going to be 2021. It's estimated at the moment until our overall level of debt actually starts to reduce. So that, I think, absolutely tells a story. The point of this, and me telling you this, not to depress all of you on this already depressing weather day, is that when we actually talk about growth, which I know is in the brief for the seminar today, growth is not only restricted, but it's limited. I don't see public sector growth coming anytime soon, certainly not within the next few years. And I think that the challenge for you, rather than to actually try to identify and achieve growth, is to unlock the existing level of public finance resources that are available, which are still significant. They are in no way not insignificant. And so it's about you and your profession actually making the case differently for the funding that you actually need going forward to actually challenge what are the more traditional areas of public sector finance and local government finance as well. So that's the one image that I would have shown you. So on that background, there's three things I want to do in the short time I've got available. I think it's maybe worth having a tour through the background to the finance, and maybe just actually thinking about where does this, what seems like a free good, come from. For some of you, I know it's not finance. For some of you, it might just seem something that's never available. There's never enough of it. So I think it's right that we drop breath, step back, and just have a think about what that actually means, and give you that understanding of, from a top-down approach, just where all that money actually comes from. Secondly, I maybe want to have a think about the extent to which local government resources are decreasing, or are they increasing. If you were maybe tuned into the debate in Scotland earlier this year when the budget was announced, you would probably have come across this unbelievable, and that's the only way I can describe it, discussion between national and local politicians about whether the amount of money being provided to local government was more or was it less. And we actually spent what seemed to be a significant amount of time arguing over all of that. What I'm maybe trying to do this morning is nail that myth to the wall, if you like, and make it absolutely crystal clear, which again gives you an indication of where we're travelling in our public finances as a country. And then thirdly, and lastly, if you're still with me, what I hope is maybe give you some kind of practical insight in what you can actually do as planners, and you can take that forward this afternoon. And I'm going to give you specific steps that you can actually utilise, you can actually deploy when you're actually speaking to your finance colleagues. And I'm going to give you a number of questions that you can actually ask, which not only can you take away with you, but hopefully won't be set a bit of an agenda for you over the course of the day. And I might be being mischievous by doing that, but you're going to have the opportunity to actually challenge those who are coming to tell you about good and best practice, whatever you want to call it, but also your finance colleagues who are in the room as well. Okay, let's go right to the top then, our UK public finances. If we were to add up all the public spending in the United Kingdom, and if we were to add up all the income as a public sector that we actually receive, it would look pretty much like this. And let me say, I make no apology at this stage for making this as simple as possible. Okay, some of you may be ingrained in this, some of you may understand it. Absolutely, that's great. You can assist me in this, but for many people this will be seen for the very first time. We actually spend in excess of £750 billion as a country, heading towards £800 billion. That's a massive amount of money. That's what we spend on armed forces, on social security, on local government, on various public services as well. To actually fund that, what do? Well, we actually tax ourselves, and we levy a series of taxes on ourselves. And again, if we added all of that up, that would come to around about £720 billion. Now, the first thing that you'll probably notice is that the amount of money that we're bringing in is less than the amount of money that we're actually spending. And that's where we actually end up with this term called budget deficit, which you maybe hear politicians actually talking about. That's the difference between the amount of money we're actually receiving and the amount of money that we want to actually pay out. And it's clearly never a good idea to actually pay more money out than you're actually bringing in. It's not something you would do in your private life, is it? You just wouldn't do that. You wouldn't, would you? Not many people are agreeing with me. No? Okay, here's free financial management advice. Okay, bad idea to do something like that. But governments do. It's not unusual, and it's not unnatural for specific governments, because in fact what you're doing is you're funding services on the forward expectation that there will be tax income becoming available. But the difference between spend and our income is the budget deficit. And when you do hear politicians saying, or even celebrating, that our budget deficit is going down, there's still a budget deficit. Okay, so it's not something to be celebrated or be congratulated. We've still actually generated less money than we actually need to. Let's have a closer look at taxation. I know that taxation is the driest subject in the world, so I won't overly dwell on this. But that gives you an indication, I think, of the basket of taxation that we actually use traditionally and historically as a country to actually fund our services, all services throughout the United Kingdom, including our devolved services as well. And what you'll actually see there, right at the bottom of that chart, which does add up to £721 billion, is the level of income related to taxes. That's the taxation that's actually taken from you on the basis of PAYE, along with national insurance. And that formulates probably around about 40% of all the taxation that we actually generate as a country. And you'll see that there's other areas of corporation tax, value-added tax as well, a whole range of taxes, which is how we've usually operated our finances as a country. maybe worth just looking at one of the small bars in there, which is council tax. It's maybe about a third of the way down, and it's council taxation, £30 billion, and that's for the UK. The Scottish element of that is £2 billion, so less than 0.5%. What is that? Is that 0.3%? 0.3% of our £721 billion is actually local taxation. And I think the significance of that is that when you think of the area of discussion, the amount of discussion that is actually applied to local taxation, it seems disproportionate, doesn't it, in relation to the overall £720 billion. But that's because it's a local tax and it's related directly to local services. It's harder to actually see a relationship between the money that's taken off, what in effect is your payslip, and services, but you can do that for local taxation. But that's a whole different discussion. But that's what your taxation looks like. So as a country, that's what we're actually generating from us and from businesses. If you're actually wondering if you've heard the debate about reduction in finances over the years, there is a way to actually look at it. I don't want to give you number blindness, so please don't get hung up on all the numbers here. But if you're to actually have a look at the numbers that are boxed in red there, that in effect is the level of resources that the Scottish Government actually have to spend on an annual basis that they can choose to actually spend. And what you can actually see is from 2010-11, there is a bit of this downward trajectory. And that money comes to us through something called the Barnett formula. And if we had an extra couple of days, I could stand here and explain the Barnett formula to you, but mercifully we don't have that time. But money finds its way from Westminster through taxation to Scottish Government. They choose what they need to actually do. And that makes it fairly clear that there has been less money over the last 5 or 6 years, which was expected. And that's a demonstration as well right away of what austerity actually looks like. Less money available for public services and a continuing downward trajectory. So in 2010-11, we were spending about £28 billion. We're now looking in 2019-20 to expect to spend about £25 billion. And that's based on real terms. And again, that's another term that you'll hear people actually talking about, real terms. What that actually means is it's numbers which are adjusted for inflation, because your pound this year is worth less in times of inflation than the pound last year. And you have to make that calculation to actually make a valid comparison. What I also say is that in the green, if you look at the capital monies that we've actually got to spend, that's actually flatlined a bit, which is probably of significance for this audience. Back in 2010-11, we were expecting to invest around about 3.6 billion. It's around about 3.7 billion we're expecting going up to 2019-20. We expect. So the level of investment is probably round about the same. The pressures are coming on this line, which is broadly the amount of money that we spend on day-to-day services, and that's where the difficulty actually comes. And when you hear your local authorities, politicians and Director of Finance and finance colleagues talking about the pressures, that's primarily what they're actually talking about. They're talking about what we'd call the revenue monies going forward. So, money finds its way from Westminster to the Scottish Government, and then it comes from the Scottish Government to you as local authorities. And there's a specific calculation that actually takes place along with negotiation with COSLA, sometimes in this very building. And there's 3 elements of the vast bulk of finance that local authorities receive. Firstly, is ring-fence grants, which is a prescribed amount of money that you have to spend for specific policy reasons. And the mechanism that's utilised is through local authorities. You don't have local choice on that, but it does support a local service. Second component is non-domestic rate income, which is business rates, which is it's a national taxation in effect, but it's collected and levied almost on a local basis. NDRI is actually called, one of those other finance terms. The balance is general revenue funding, the bulk of it, the nearly £7 billion. So round about 9.5 towards £10 billion of that finds its way to local authorities, primarily to actually run day-to-day services, including roads, including education, including social work as well. And as we've actually seen, that amount of money is actually reducing over time as far as the Scottish Government is ken. So what does that mean for local government itself? Well, and I promise as the last set of numbers I will show you. Okay, and we'll go on to kind of real things. Are you getting more money or are you getting less? Well, and despite the debate that was taking place between the Finance Secretary and local authorities last year, by straight comparison, comparing it to 2016-17, there is a real terms reduction in the amount of money that's actually being provided to local authorities. And that's fact. I don't think that anyone now is disputing that, but that actually means that, yeah, we can actually confirm that there's less money available. We more or less knew that because the environment that you're in, you feel that anyway. You feel the pressures that you're actually under. You see that. There's less of you probably. There's more for you to actually do. So there's a whole host of indicators which tell you, as the experts, about what the issues are with local government finance. That's what it actually starts to look like as far as numbers are actually concerned. What does that mean, though, for day-to-day life in local authorities? Well, I quite like this graphic, which is not mine. It's from our colleagues in Audit Scotland, bless their cotton socks, which actually just sets out the spending priorities. That's one bar for every single local authority in Scotland from left to right, and it sets out the spending priorities for all. The bar at the bottom is education. The middle bar, which is blue, is social work, and the green line is the cost of debt that we're actually servicing the interest. Remember that big graph that I showed you where our interest or debt is getting higher? Well, ultimately, when local authorities borrow as well, we have to repay that debt in the way that you would have to pay overdraft interest or you have to pay mortgage interest as well. All of it actually has to be repaid. And what you can actually see then is that some of the big priorities, education, social work, but repaying our debt currently is also a priority. Why is that important? Well, everything else is where realistically we need to find savings on the basis that there's political protection for education, given the national agenda for education. There is not only political but moral protection around social work services as well. And so the chances are when local authorities are looking for savings, it's actually going to be in that yellow area, which probably you fit into. You're all there as well. That's everything else, including roads. And it's probably at the extreme right end of that, where there is maybe scope to identify savings, but it's going to be out with education and social work. So we're getting less money, you're expected to do more, but the priorities haven't changed. In fact, they actually increase, which is starting to, as I say, build this picture that the achievement of growth is likely to be unrealistic. It's about a reconsideration of what we do with our existing resources. And that's where you actually have a role to actually play. So what can you do then? What can you do? I appreciate that this is a new area for you, and this is a very, very brief tour through finance. Well, I think that from years of actually speaking to politicians, to roads engineers, to teachers, to social workers, and I've got to say to planners as well, I think you've actually got to understand what we're talking about. Learn our language. There are CIPFA members that's in the room in the week this afternoon. I'm immensely proud of all of them. They do a great job. But they're positively brilliant at confusing you because we talk in what seems like a foreign language. And I think that one of the first things, and it's an easy thing, is that you need to understand what we're actually talking about. For example, today is all about infrastructure. I wonder if how many of you know what that actually means. How would you, if I asked you, define infrastructure? I'm not going to, but I could. But there is a specific definition, an accounting definition of infrastructure. So be clear what you're actually talking about. Learn what you actually mean. I've shown you a number of slides there, which actually has various terms on it, BGA, CFCR. None of you stopped me to ask me what they actually are. Do you know them? I'm assuming that maybe you do, but probably you don't, in effect. So to actually have the conversation that I think you want to have with your finance colleagues, you've got to know what we're talking about. How do you do that? Well, you ask them. Get them to actually tell you what they are actually talking about. Stop them and ask them. And then secondly, I think that there are a number of questions that you can ask yourself without actually being an expert on finance. Now, the reason I'm saying this is that I do have, from time to time, have to take national as well as local politicians through the kind of documents that my finance colleagues actually prepare. Politicians, with the best one in the world, will never be and are not expected to be experts. They can't be. but they have to know enough to actually scrutinise not only the information that you provide, but the information that my professional finance colleagues provide as well. And I tell them to ask four things. It's principles of financial scrutiny. I get them to ask 4 things. And I will tell you that. Okay, I'll come to that in a moment. But thirdly, and this is probably key for all of you, is get to think in medium to long term. That's where we're actually going as a country. And we're actually going to introduce, and it's going to start with government, more and further medium to long term planning. As planners, that's probably great news for you. You probably always do think long term, and you're maybe frustrated at the extent of political short term thinking that actually comes along. But starting with the next couple of years, there is actually going to be a requirement for longer term financial planning from the Scottish Government. And if it's required for them, they're going to expect of you as local authorities. Your contribution can be to that, to actually contribute to that agenda by actually thinking about what that means for your plans. So what are the 4 things that you need to actually think about? This is what I say to politicians, both national and local, when they're actually expected to scrutinise and to understand in part some of the financial information that they actually get through you. As you get them to think about affordability, about whether something's a priority or not, and if it delivers value for money, and the extent to which there is a robust process behind all of that. We call them the 4 principles of financial scrutiny. My expectation is that right away, if you can't afford something, then it just won't get done, so you have to demonstrate that it's affordable. Prioritisation means it actually has to be part of not only a service plan, but also the Council's long-term plans. And I was taken by what Irene said right at the outset about what seems to be disconnect between various plans. I would find it surprising if there is any disconnect between plans. So hopefully I picked that up wrong. But politicians and you will have to see it directly prioritised and clearly identified in strategic, corporate and service plans as well. Does it deliver value for money? Hopefully don't have to open up a debate about value for money as well. You're going to have to demonstrate that that's what is evident. And finally, the process that is robust to actually take you through all of that. That's what your politicians, if they'll listen to me, will be asking you for the kind of financial information that you put in front of them. On a practical basis, what does that actually look like? Well, if we're thinking and applying each of the 4 principles to specific questions, which I think you will be expected to answer, which you will be thinking about applying as well, is about the extent to which the capital programme actually delivers and reports to the strategic objectives of the local authority, of the public body. Is it prioritised, in effect? And the extent to which you assess the cost, the investment over the whole life of the investment, and it's not just about the borrowing cost short term. What are you actually going to get from all of it? How do you actually set that out? What does that actually look like? Be able to answer that question. And thirdly, are the assets fully utilised? Can you actually deliver on everything that you've actually got? Including the question, do you need further infrastructure? Worked separately with a range of bodies south of the border who are actually set up to invest in infrastructure. And one of the first things we actually did was to compile for them a collective balance sheet which showed all the assets that they actually have at the moment, a number of which were actually excess. Conclusion was they maybe didn't need to actually invest in the type of infrastructure that they were looking to, but in any event went ahead and did it anyway because they had the funding to actually do it. Answer that one for me. And then lastly, the process that you actually have to appraise major projects, which will be an assessment about how robust that process is. So that's actually 4 things, 4 simple questions: affordability, prioritisation, value for money, and process. And I have to admit, in putting that together when I first spoke to, and it was a set of national politicians on that, I inadvertently, I think maybe for visual purposes, coloured in the boxes and ended up with what looks like, and it kind of works almost like a traffic light scenario, because if it's not affordable, then you're stopped. You're just not going to do it at all under any circumstances. You can only go if it is prioritised. The value for money is the bit in between, which means that you actually demonstrate the extent between the relationship of prioritisation and affordability. And you have to be certain of the robust nature of the process overall. That ended up just being a bit gimmicky, but sometimes politicians understand that. Sometimes we all understand. I certainly do. It reports to my thought process. So, when you're actually speaking this afternoon about the good practice that you're actually going to hear about, I think the takeaway for you is these 4 questions to actually challenge everything that's been said against the background of what that looks like. Prioritisation, affordability, VFM, and the robust nature of the process.